I thought I was standing in my own living room. I thought I was the woman whose name was on the mortgage, whose savings account had been drained over 3 careful years to make the down payment, whose hands had painted every wall in this house the exact shade of warm ivory she'd chosen on a slow Saturday at the hardware store, rolling the color sample between her fingers until she was absolutely certain. I thought all of that meant something. I thought it meant the house was mine. "If you behave," Patricia said, setting her teacup down on my grandmother's end table with the soft clink of fine china meeting old wood, "maybe my son will let you watch TV this weekend." She smiled when she said it. That was the part that stayed with me for weeks afterward. Not the words themselves, as grotesque as they were, but the smile. Warm? Patient? The kind of smile a kindergarten teacher gives a child who has finally learned to sit still. She looked at me as though I were a problem she had already solved, as though the outcome of this particular situation had been decided long before I walked into the room, and all that remained was for me to catch up with everyone else. I didn't say anything. I stood there with a dish towel in my hand and my heart doing something strange and fast in my chest, and I didn't say a single word. That silence, that particular silence, is something I have thought about many times since. I wish I could go back to it. I wish I could reach through time and shake myself by the shoulders and say, "This is the moment. This is exactly the moment you should have understood what was happening." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got there. My name is Clara. I am 34 years old, and I have always been, for most of my life, the kind of person who prefers to fix things quietly. I don't mean that as a compliment. I mean that somewhere along the way, I learned that conflict was expensive, that peace was worth almost any price, and that the fastest route to a calm room was to say yes and mean it, or say yes and lie, and sort out my feelings alone afterward, usually in the car, parked in some lot with the engine running and the heat on and the radio turned low. I grew up watching my parents negotiate every meal, every holiday, every small domestic decision into an exhausting diplomatic treaty. And I think somewhere inside that childhood, I decided I would never be the reason a room went tense. I would be the person who smoothed things over. I would be easy. For a long time, I genuinely believed that quality had served me well. The house was mine, technically and entirely. I'd bought it 2 years before I met Daniel. A small craftsman bungalow on a street just beginning to be discovered, which meant the coffee shop on the corner was excellent and the parking was still manageable. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with original tile that I'd spent a full weekend cleaning with a toothbrush, a backyard with an old oak tree that shed leaves in catastrophic quantities every autumn. I loved it with the particular fierceness of someone who has never had a place of her own before. I'd been renting since I was 22, in apartments where the walls were thin and the heat was unreliable, and nothing, not a nail, not a shelf, not a single personal object, could be considered permanent. The house changed all of that. The house was, for the first time in my adult life, mine in a way that felt real and solid and not contingent on anyone else's goodwill. I used to come home from work and stand in the front doorway for a moment before going in, just to feel that, just to feel the realness of it. I met Daniel at a work conference in the spring, 2 years after I moved in. He was tall and a little shy in the charming way that some tall men are, as though they'd never quite gotten used to taking up space. He worked in data analytics, which sounds dry, but he talked about it the way some people talk about music, with a quiet, specific passion that I found immediately appealing. He made me coffee on our third date and remembered I took it with oat milk, not regular milk, and something about that small remembered detail undid me completely. We were engaged by the following spring. We were married in September, in the backyard under the oak tree, with my best friend Margot crying through the entire ceremony and Daniel's hands shaking when he took mine. Patricia, Daniel's mother, was at the wedding, of course. I'd met her 6 times before that day, each time for no more than a few hours, and my impression of her was specific and consistent. A small, elegantly put-together woman in her early 60s, with short silver hair and excellent posture, and a string of pearls she wore regardless of the occasion. She had opinions about everything but delivered them gently, as though offering gifts. She had opinions about my neighborhood, charming but the traffic must be dreadful. About my career in marketing, the salary is good but the hours must be so demanding. About the fact that Daniel and I would live in my house rather than buy somewhere new together. Well, I suppose that's practical. Each observation was warm, slightly sad, and landed just slightly wrong, like a picture hung at an angle you couldn't correct without admitting you'd noticed it. I smiled back. I said things like absolutely and you're probably right. I was being easy. What I did not understand then, what I would spend the next 14 months learning, slowly with great pain, was that Patricia was not a woman who made offhand observations. Patricia was a woman who gathered information. Daniel settled into the house with a comfort that surprised and pleased me. He fixed the kitchen faucet that had dripped since I moved in. He planted tomatoes in the backyard and failed spectacularly, and we laughed about it over dinner in the golden light of our first summer together. He learned which evenings I needed silence and which evenings I needed conversation, and he gave me both without being asked. The house smelled of his coffee and his particular soap, and those smells mixed with the old oak and the warm tile and the things that had always been mine. And the result was the smell of a real life, of a life I had chosen and was choosing and would keep choosing. I was happy. I was genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. And because I had always suspected happiness was more fragile than it looked, I was careful with it. I tended it like something that could break. The first sign of trouble was so small that I genuinely would not have registered it as a sign at all if I hadn't understood much later what it actually was. It was November, about 8 months after the wedding. Daniel's mother called on a Tuesday evening while we were doing the dishes together. Me washing, him drying, that particular domestic comfort I had come to love. And he took the call in the bedroom with the door half closed. This was not unusual. He called his mother 2 or 3 times a week, which I had always found sweet. What was unusual was the length of the call and the quiet. He wasn't talking, or at least I couldn't hear him talking. I noticed the silence from the kitchen, felt a small, embarrassing dart of something I immediately labeled paranoia and pushed it away. He came back 20 minutes later looking normal. He picked up the dish towel. He dried the last of the glasses. When I asked who had called, he said, "Just Mom," with a particular casualness that I now know is one of the most dangerous phrases in the English language. The second sign came at Christmas. Patricia had come to stay for the week, the first time she'd stayed with us, and I had cleaned the house for 2 days in preparation, bought the good coffee, put fresh flowers in the guest room. She arrived with 2 large suitcases for a 7-day visit, which should perhaps have told me something. And she moved through the house with a proprietary attention that I found immediately unsettling and immediately talked myself out of finding unsettling. She opened cabinets. She looked into closets. She stood in the backyard on the second morning, turning slowly, looking at the fence line, at the garage, at the oak tree, with her hands clasped behind her back like a general surveying a battlefield. I watched her from the kitchen window with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I told myself, she's just curious. She loves Daniel and she wants to know where he lives. This is normal. The comment about the television came on Christmas afternoon. I had spent the morning cooking. The turkey was good. The table looked beautiful. My grandmother's linen tablecloth, the candles I'd bought from the farmer's market, the wine. There was a moment before we sat down when I looked at the table and felt something close to pride, the satisfaction of having made something beautiful and real. We ate. The conversation was easy, and then, as I was clearing plates, Patricia settled herself on the sofa, reached across to my side table where the remote control always lived, picked it up without hesitation, without asking, without even glancing in my direction, and changed the channel. Such a small thing. I know it is such a small thing. But the quality of the gesture, the complete absence of hesitation, the sense of perfect entitlement, the way she moved through my living room as though it were already hers, lodged in me like a splinter I could feel but not locate. I said nothing. Daniel didn't notice. She left on the 27th. I spent 2 days thoroughly cleaning the guest room and then felt better, and I told myself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. February brought the conversation I have since reconstructed many times in my memory, trying to identify the exact moment I should have panicked. Daniel and I had dinner with Patricia at her apartment, a high-rise with a concierge and a long view. And she'd made pasta, and the apartment smelled of garlic and the expensive candles she kept on every surface. She was in a good mood. She refilled my wine glass twice without being asked, which I now understand was a performance. She asked about my job, the marketing campaign I was running, and she listened with her hands folded and her eyes warm and attentive. And I felt the particular pleasure of being liked by someone whose approval you have wanted and not quite received. And then, over tiramisu, she said pleasantly, easily, as though it were a natural and obvious next step in the conversation, I was thinking it might make sense for me to take a look at the paperwork on the house. I held my fork still. Sorry? The mortgage documents, she said. The original purchase agreement. Daniel mentioned the rates weren't ideal when you bought, and with the way things have shifted, it might be worth exploring refinancing. I have a contact at a very good firm. I looked at Daniel. He was eating his tiramisu with the focused concentration of a man who is concentrating on his tiramisu and nothing else. He did not look up. That's very kind, I said, but I think we're all right. Of course, she said. Just a thought. We're family, after all. I didn't give her the documents. But driving home that night, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel clearly in months. A low, cold unease, the sensation of a door opening in a house I thought I knew, revealing a room I hadn't known was there. I pushed it away. She was just trying to help. Daniel loved her. She loved Daniel. This was what families did. In the car, Daniel said, "She just wants to help, you know." "I know," I said. We didn't speak about it again. I should have spoken about it again. I should have demanded we speak about it again, right then, in the car, in the dark, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but be honest with each other. But I was easy. I was still, even then, trying to be easy. Spring arrived, and with it a phone call that changed the shape of everything. It was a Saturday in late April, the kind of morning that makes you believe things will be fine. The oak tree had just come back into full leaf, and the light through the kitchen window was that particular gold I associated with every good thing I had ever felt. I had my coffee in the mug with the small chip on the rim. Daniel had gone to the gym. The house was quiet in the satisfying way that clean, loved houses are quiet, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a book I wasn't really reading, just being still, just being exactly where I wanted to be. My phone rang. An unfamiliar local number. I almost didn't answer. The woman on the other end identified herself as Sandra Greer, a paralegal with a firm I didn't recognize. She said she was calling regarding a property matter. She asked if I was Clara Walsh. Walsh was my maiden name, the name still on the original deed. I said yes. She asked if I was aware that an inquiry had been made on my property at 4712 Elmwood Drive. I set my coffee mug down very carefully. What kind of inquiry? A brief pause. A valuation inquiry, she said. We'd received some preliminary documents suggesting a possible change of ownership in the coming months. I just wanted to confirm that you were aware of the process. The world did not stop. That is not how it works, actually. The world keeps being exactly what it was a moment ago. The light still gold, the tree still green, the coffee still steaming, and you sit in the middle of all of it and try to make the words you just heard form a shape that makes any sense at all. A possible change of ownership, my house, my name on the deed. I'm not aware of any such process, I said. My voice sounded very even. It did not match what was happening in my chest. I see, she said. I may have made an error. I apologize for disturbing you. She ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. The oak tree moved in the wind outside the window. Somewhere down the street, someone was mowing a lawn, the sound steady and ordinary and completely indifferent to the fact that my world had just cracked down the middle. My coffee went cold. I picked up my phone, put it down, picked it up again. I thought about calling Margot. I thought about calling my father. I thought about a dozen things and did none of them, because I was still, even in that moment, trying to stay easy. Trying not to overreact, trying to be the kind of person who doesn't cause scenes. Daniel came home from the gym an hour later, smelling of soap and effort, carrying the particular good energy of someone who has just exercised. He kissed the top of my head and said, "Morning, love," and opened the refrigerator, and I watched him from the table. The ease of his shoulders, the familiar way he moved through the kitchen that had been mine and was now ours. And I thought, tell me right now that this is nothing. Tell me there's been a mistake. I will believe whatever you say, because I need to believe it. A law firm called me this morning, I said, about our house. He turned from the refrigerator. His face, in that first unguarded half-second, did something I will never be able to fully describe and will never be able to forget. It was not surprise. It was something closer to calculation, a quick, invisible adjustment, the deliberate closing of a shutter. And then, in the very next second, it was confusion, concern. The face of a husband who had no idea what his wife was talking about. "What?" he said. "A valuation inquiry," I said. "A possible change of ownership. Do you know anything about that?" He frowned. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from me and put his hands flat on the table. His hands were steady. "Clara, that doesn't make any sense. We haven't asked anyone to value the house." I looked at his hands. I looked at his face. I looked at the man I had married under the oak tree, whose hands had shaken when he took mine, who had remembered the oat milk. "I know," I said, but something in me had shifted. Something small and silent, like a key turning in a lock in a house I could no longer quite recognize as my own. That afternoon, I did something I had never done before in the 2 years we'd lived in the house together. I waited. I made sure Daniel had a reason to leave. I mentioned we were out of wine, suggested he make a run to the store on Beaumont Street. And the moment his car turned the corner, I walked into the small room we used as a study, sat down at his desk, and opened his laptop. I am not a person who goes through other people's things. I need you to understand that. I have never read someone's messages without permission, never checked a phone, never opened a letter addressed to someone else. Whatever I believed about trust, I believed in it in the practical, daily way. The way you believe in gravity, not because you've studied the physics, but because it simply works, because things stay where you put them. But something had shifted in me during those long hours at the kitchen table with the cold coffee. Something quiet and irreversible. And when I sat down at Daniel's desk, my hands were perfectly steady. That steadiness frightened me more than shaking would have. The folder was not hidden. That was perhaps the thing that undid me most completely, even more than what was inside it. The fact that it was just there, in his documents folder, labeled with a name that was almost innocent. Property notes, Mum. As though it were recipes, as though it were a thoughtful son keeping track of a renovation his mother was considering. I double-clicked it, and the folder opened, and there were 7 documents inside, and I started with the one at the top, and I read it with the particular focused clarity of someone who has stepped outside of fear and into pure information-gathering mode, because fear requires the belief that things might still be fine. And somewhere in the previous 8 hours, I had let go of that belief. The first document was a draft quitclaim deed. It was dated 3 weeks ago. My name was on it as grantor. The property address was mine. Our address, my house, 4712 Elmwood Drive. The grantee was Patricia Ann Whitmore. And at the bottom, in the signature line marked Clara Walsh, there was a signature. It was not my signature. It was close enough that I could see the effort that had gone into studying mine, the particular way I loop the C, the length of the descending line on the Y. But it was not mine. I had never signed this document. I had never been shown this document. I had never been consulted, informed, or asked. I sat back in the chair. The study was very quiet. From the street outside, I could hear the distant sound of a dog barking, and the oak tree moved once in the wind, a soft sound of leaves against glass. My hands still steady on the desk, my heart doing something complicated and enormous in my chest. I thought, this is what the paralegal was calling about. This is what the valuation inquiry was. Patricia had taken a forged quitclaim deed with my name in my house to a law firm. She had taken it as though it were real, as though I had signed it freely, as though this were simply a matter of paperwork being processed. And Daniel's laptop had a folder about it. A folder with 7 documents, 3 weeks old. I opened the second document. It was an email thread, printed and scanned into a PDF, which told me someone had been careful about keeping records, or perhaps someone had been careful about being found. The first email was from Daniel to Patricia, dated 6 weeks ago. It read, in full, Mum, spoke to the solicitor. He says the quitclaim route is cleanest if she hasn't added me to the deed yet. Once it goes through, the title transfers fully to you, and we start the next step. Don't push on the refinancing thing again. She's suspicious. The response, Patricia to Daniel, 2 hours later. Understood, darling. I'll wait. You've been so patient with all of this. Once the house is in my name, we'll sort the rest properly. She'll understand eventually, or she won't. But either way, it won't be her decision anymore. I read the email 3 times. I read it with the specific, grinding attention of someone who is trying very hard to construct a reality in which those words mean something other than what they mean. She'll understand eventually, or she won't, but either way, it won't be her decision anymore. My house, my name, my signature, practiced, forged, filed, and Daniel, my husband, my person, the man who had remembered the oat milk, writing to his mother, "She's suspicious. Don't push. Not, this is wrong. Not, I can't do this. She's suspicious." As though my suspicion were the problem. As though the danger in this situation was that I might notice. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light in the study to shift from afternoon to early evening, the gold going thin and gray in the way it does in late April when the day decides it's done. Long enough for my feelings to go through several complete and distinct phases. The shock, which was blinding and total, like being hit. Then the grief, which arrived fast and brutal and was somehow worse than the shock. Then the anger, which came last of all, and was nothing like what I had expected anger to feel like. I had always been afraid of my own anger, afraid of what it would do to a room, to a relationship, to the careful architecture of peacekeeping I had spent my life constructing. But this anger was not hot. It was not wild or destructive or desperate. It was cold, and it was clear, and it was mine. And it was, I realized, with something close to wonder, the only thing in the room I was completely certain of. I heard Daniel's car in the driveway. I heard the front door. I heard him call my name. I closed the laptop. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there, and when he turned from the counter and saw my face, I watched him understand. Not gradually. All at once. A single terrible instant of comprehension, and then the shudder again, the controlled adjustment, and then he said my name, with the warm, slightly worried tone of a man coming home to a wife who has had a difficult day. "Clara," he said. "You okay?" "No," I said. I found the folder. The bottle of wine he was holding stayed exactly where it was for a long moment. Then he set it down, slowly, the way you set things down when you're buying time to think. He looked at the counter. He looked at his hands. He looked at everything in the kitchen except me. "Clara," he started. "The quitclaim deed," I said. "The email to your mother, 6 weeks ago." I kept my voice level. The coldness helped. I found all of it. He exhaled, a long, slow breath, the kind that contains a great many things being set aside. "I can explain," he said. "Then explain." And he did, or he tried to. What came out was not an explanation so much as a sedimentation of smaller failures, each one resting on the one below it. His mother had financial problems he hadn't told me about. A debt, a bad investment, something she was embarrassed about. She had come to him a year ago before we were even married and asked for help. He tried to help with money, but it wasn't enough. She had this idea. The house, just temporarily, just so she could secure a line of credit against it. Nothing would actually change. He'd always planned to tell me. He just hadn't found the right moment. He hadn't thought it would actually go anywhere. He hadn't understood she'd forged the signature without telling him first. He had never wanted her to file it. He had simply... And here he paused, and I watched him search for the word that would cost him the least. Not stopped her. The word sat between us in the kitchen like something physical. Not stopped her. He had not stopped her. He had written an email coaching her on legal strategy. The quitclaim route is cleanest. But he had not stopped her. He had watched me live in my house, cook in my kitchen, tend my garden, and he had not stopped her. "You wrote to her," I said. "You told her I was suspicious. You told her not to push the refinancing because I might notice." He opened his mouth. He closed it. "You were protecting the plan," I said. "Not me, the plan." "Clara, I love you. I never meant for it to get this far." "How far did you mean for it to get?" He had no answer for that. He stood in my kitchen with the wine he had brought home to share with his wife, and he had no answer for that, and the silence was the most honest thing he had said all evening. I told him to call his mother. I told him she needed to come over. He tried to argue. It was late. We should talk first, just the two of us. And I said, in a voice I had never used in my life, quiet and precise as a blade, "Call her, now, or I call the police." Patricia arrived 40 minutes later. She came to the door in a cashmere cardigan and her pearls, which told me she had chosen them deliberately, that she understood a certain kind of armor when she needed it. She kissed Daniel on the cheek. She looked at me with the expression she had always used, warm, patient, faintly sorry for the trouble I was causing, and said, "Clara, dear," as though this were a misunderstanding, as though I were a child whose feelings needed managing. "Sit down," I said. She sat. I placed the printed copies I had made of both documents on the coffee table, my grandmother's table, the same table she had set her teacup on in December with such comfortable familiarity. I watched her look at them. I watched the calculation in her eyes. Not surprise, never surprise, but a rapid, experienced assessment of the situation, the way a chess player looks at a board that has changed. "You forged my signature," I said. "Clara, I think we need to be careful about language here. You forged my signature on a legal document transferring my house to your name. That is forgery. That is fraud." I was aware of Daniel standing at the edge of the room, by the bookshelf, not sitting, not speaking, occupying the space with the particular quality of a man who has decided that if he stays very still, he may not need to make any further decisions tonight. And your son knew. "He was trying to protect me," Patricia said, and her voice shifted, the warmth thickening into something that was designed to make me feel cruel for pushing. "I've been in a very difficult position financially, and he loves me. That's what families do. They protect each other. By committing property fraud, by finding solutions." She folded her hands in her lap. "Clara, I have always tried to include you in this family. If you had been more flexible, more willing to think of this as a partnership rather than your own asset," I said. "That's the word you're looking for. You've always seen this house as an asset to be managed. Not my home, not my life. Your asset." She looked at me for a long moment. The warmth dropped. Underneath it was something much older and much colder. Not malice exactly, but a kind of absolute certainty. The certainty of someone who has always gotten what she decided to have and cannot quite believe this is the conversation she is being required to have. "You don't understand what it is to sacrifice for a family," she said quietly. "I think it's time you left," I said. "This is the last time you'll be in this house." She left. Daniel followed her to the door, and I heard them whispering in the hallway, and the sound of it. The two of them, together, at the threshold of my house, was the last thing that needed to break before I was completely free of the instinct to save this. That night, I called my father. He had been a real estate attorney for 30 years before he retired, and when I told him what I had found, he was quiet for a moment, and then said in the steady voice he has always used for the worst things, "Are the documents still on the laptop?" I told him yes. He said, "Screenshot everything. Send it to yourself and to me. Don't let Daniel near that laptop again tonight." I did exactly that, standing at the desk in the dark study, the screen bright against the quiet of the house. Daniel had gone to the guest room. I had not asked him to. He had simply gone, which told me he understood, at some level he was not yet willing to name, that this was over. My father came the following morning with a colleague, an attorney named Gwen who specialized in property fraud, and they sat at my kitchen table with coffee and the printed documents and spoke in the careful, direct language of people who have seen this kind of thing before and know exactly what it is. The forged quitclaim deed constituted fraud. The email constituted evidence of conspiracy. The law firm Patricia had approached, the one the paralegal Sandra had called from, could be subpoenaed for records of the submission. Daniel's communications, if he had used his work accounts, could be legally discoverable. Gwen looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "You didn't sign anything you didn't mean to sign. The deed is void. The question now is whether you want to pursue criminal charges." I thought about it for exactly 1 moment. "Yes," I said. The next weeks moved with the particular grinding momentum of legal processes, slow in some ways, faster than I expected in others. A cease and desist was filed against Patricia. The law firm that had received the fraudulent deed received a formal notification of its fraudulent nature, which created, in the legal language Gwen used, a cloud on any attempt to move forward with the document. Patricia hired her own attorney, a man named Carver, who sent a long letter suggesting that Clara had been confused about the nature of informal family financial discussions, which was such a naked piece of gaslighting that even Gwen, who was not a woman easily provoked, set the letter down and shook her head. The criminal complaint was filed. It moved slowly, as these things do, but it moved. Daniel tried twice to speak to me at length about reconciliation. The first conversation was genuine in its way. He cried, which surprised me because I had not known he could, and he said things that were true and painful, that he had never valued what he had until he saw what protecting her had cost him, that his mother had been shaping his decisions since before he understood what decisions were, that he had been afraid of her disappointment his entire life and had let that fear grow into something that hurt people. I listened. I believed him, or believed that he believed it. But there is a particular knowledge that once you have it, you cannot unknow it, that when the moment came, when the choice was plain, he had written the email. He had said, "She's suspicious. Don't push." And in that moment, he had chosen. I could grieve it, and I did, but I could not undo it. Divorce proceedings were filed 6 weeks after I found the folder. Daniel did not contest the terms. He moved to his mother's apartment, which I thought was probably the most honest conclusion he'd ever arrived at without anyone's help. Patricia was charged with forgery and fraud. She did not go to prison. The plea was reduced with Gwen's tactical consent to probation and a substantial fine, because the deed had never technically been executed in the full legal sense. But the charges were public record. The law firm Carver had filed with dropped her as a client. The concierge building she lived in had a small but real community, and communities talk. She lost the particular social armor she had always worn, the warm, patient face, the pearls, the reputation for being a good woman who only ever wanted to help. It turned out, as these things often do, that she had done something like this before. A former daughter-in-law years ago, a different property, a different form of pressure. That woman called me. We had a long, strangely comforting phone conversation in which two people who had never met said, alternately, I thought I was imagining it. We were not imagining it. Months passed. The house settled back into itself, slowly, the way any lived-in space takes on the character of the person living in it, releasing the energy of the people who are no longer there. I repainted the guest room, which had been Patricia's room, a deep, warm green that I had always wanted somewhere in the house and never had a reason to choose. Margot came and helped, and we made a mess of it and laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Green paint on our hands and on the drop cloth, and somehow on the ceiling. My father came for dinner the following Sunday and sat at the kitchen table with his wine and said, looking at the new color visible through the doorway, "That's a good green." It was. It really was. The oak tree dropped its leaves in October in the catastrophic way it always did, and I raked them on a Saturday afternoon with the radio on, in the clean autumn light. I thought about Daniel and felt something that was no longer grief and not quite anger, something older and quieter, the feeling of looking at a scar and understanding that it has already done most of what it will do to you. I thought about Patricia, briefly, the way you briefly think about whether you have already survived. I stood in the backyard with my rake and my leaves and my green room visible through the kitchen window, and the oak tree was enormous and bare and completely mine, and I thought, this is what it was always supposed to feel like. The name on the deed, the key in the lock, the life that no one else could sign away. I went inside. I made coffee. I remembered the oat milk. I had always been the kind of person who kept the peace at any price. I had believed that was a quality worth having. Now I know the difference between peace that costs nothing and peace that costs everything, between the quiet that comes from being easy and the quiet that comes from knowing in every room of your life that what is yours has been fought for and held and kept.